What is going on, fam? Welcome back to Adobo Moto, and today we're talking about sport bike technology. Sport bike tech is here. It's not going anywhere, but I've been reading a lot of mixed opinions in the comment section. I figured this would be an interesting video to make. There's a lot of differing opinion, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what motorcycle technology actually is. So let's dive deep. So what is motorcycle technology? Well, for me, it's anything that's been added ever since I started riding motorcycles. For instance, when I started riding motorcycles, fuel-injected sport bikes was pretty much standard. Quick shifting wasn't really a thing. We didn't really have speed sensors to determine our correct speed on the sport bikes. If you wanted like a correct calibration, you'd have to buy something called a speedo healer, and you'd have to tune the bike yourself based on adjustments. It was weird, like doing 80 miles an hour on a Yamaha R6 wasn't doing 80 miles an hour. But now I think the speedo healer is like obsolete. We have quick shifters and auto blippers standard. We have semi-active suspension that gives us on-the-fly damping. Shit, my Aprilia RSV4 doesn't even have manual preload adjustments. I think I have like 3 options between soft, medium, and hard. But let's take it back a step. In 2008, we saw the introduction of the world's first ABS sport bike, and that was the 2008 CBR 1000 RR, which happened to be the first leader bike I ever owned. I love that motorcycle. It's super light, power delivery is insanely great, but I also heard that the 08s consume a lot of oil. But you know, we'll overlook that because Honda is so freaking reliable. Now, I think a year later, BMW came out with ABS as well, and then in 2012, we saw our first taste of the IMU, the Inertial Measurement Unit, which sounds sophisticated, but it's not really that sophisticated because apparently our smartphones have had the IMU technology for a while. In 2015, we saw the 6-axis IMU from Yamaha. Of course, they claim to be the first ones to use IMU technology, but the APRC and the Aprilia was actually the first one to use the IMU. But that's not the point of today's video. Back to the technology side, we have so many sensors in our motorcycles now because of the IMU. In a nutshell, if you lean the bike over, go to do a wheelie, a stoppie, brake hard, if your tires break loose, if you're accelerating out of a corner, and everything in between, the sensors in modern motorcycles, especially super bikes, is supposed to help you ride better, but does it really help you ride better? Those are the kinds of comments I'm seeing. There's a lot of old heads in the comment section saying, well, I started on a motorcycle that was just pure raw power. We didn't have any ABS or traction control, launch control. In fact, my traction control is all in my wrist. These kids are soft. They don't know what it's like to be da 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 da. And then I made a video about the ZX4RR comparing it to the ZX6R. And the one thing that I found funny was some people said they would pick the ZX6R if it just had an updated TFT color display. Now, I can agree to that to some extent because personally, I think the CBR 600RR has the ugliest dash I've ever seen in my life, but to choose the ZX4RR over a ZX6R because it doesn't have a color TFT display? When did we become such babies about technology? I'm still living in the generation where power beats anything else. For $1,000 more, I'd rather have a ZX6R over the ZX4RR. And it's not just about the power. There's this big trend going on about slow bikes fast and how slow bikes are a lot better for street, da 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 da. But honestly, I've been riding 1000 cc's for the better half of my riding career. Are they too much for the street? Yes, I agree with that. I would also argue that 1000 cc is too much for the track unless you're racing in like a 1000 cc class. So for me, a 600cc is a slow bike. If you think about slow bike fast, it's mostly for track use. Personally, on the street, you would want something with plenty of torque. Nobody who's racing a cripple triple at the track is actually riding a cripple triple on the street. And if you don't know what a cripple triple is, it's basically a 4-cylinder 600cc with one of the cylinders disabled. Yes, it's still moving. There's a piston inside, but there's no spark or fuel going to it. I made a short video about that. You guys can go check it out if you want. Now, back to the argument at hand. Is sport bike technology making us worse riders. Now here's my take on that. I think technology in motorcycles is amazing. I think having active damping is insanely cool. If you're not racing and you're like a street guy who does track days, it's nice to know that your suspension is always working and always adjusting, and it's less to think about, especially on the street, but even more so at the track. Tire wear is a huge concern, and there's many factors including suspension setup and sometimes just running the right tire pressure. It could mean the difference between tires lasting 2 or 3 track days or 3 or 4 track days. And tires aren't freaking cheap, man. So I think electronic suspension is pretty nice when it comes to like tire management and just overall comfortability and convenience. One of the things that I love that they develop now that I wish every super sport had from the factory is the quick shifter and auto blipper. Yes, some 600cc's actually come with quick shifter standard, but the only bike that I can think of that comes with auto blip down is the Aprilia RS660, and that's a super twin. It's not really a 600 super sport. Now let's talk about that bike for a second. The RS660 is the only one in its class that runs a 6-axis IMU. It has all the electronics that you could want minus electronic suspension, so it's essentially a mini super bike. I love that bike. I don't really care what people say about reliability. I think once you take them to the track, they're all unreliable. Now let's break down what a motorcycle actually is. It's a motor with 2 wheels and it's powered by gasoline, usually. Yes, there's electric motorcycles now, but we're not talking about that. I still think they're too heavy and they don't have enough range. Technology is supposed to make things better, not change things. I personally don't think technology has changed motorcycling. I think it's made things cooler and a little bit better. Could I live without electronic suspension? Absolutely. Could I live without auto blip and quick shifter? Fuck no. I love that stuff. Do I need ABS, race ABS, traction control? I'm gonna be honest with you, no. The way I ride my bike and most of my bikes that I've owned that are super bikes with all this electronic tech, I turn down the ABS as low as possible. I turn down traction control as low as possible. And I turn up the bike's power to its maximum, whether that's race, track, whatever mode that is. The reason I do that is because I don't like trying to figure out how a bike rides in certain modes. I'm very old school when it comes to motorcycles. Just give me a bike with a motor and let me be the traction control. Now, you may be indifferent about that. Maybe you like the fact that you can have a less responsive throttle, which should make the bike a little bit more tame to ride, especially if it's like 1000cc. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that either. I don't think technology is taking away from motorcycling. Again, there's a lot of old heads arguing that technology is making us worse riders. But me personally, I think a really bad rider is gonna fuck up a bike no matter how much technology it has. I mean, think about it. You still have to initially pull in the clutch to get it into gear. Even though we have things like clutchless shifting, you still have to have a lot of seat time to get good at this sport. I don't think technology is making motorcycling easier to do, because motorcycling, to do it really well, is still a very difficult thing. Sport bike technology might get better over time. In the future, we might see electronic suspension in the smaller bikes. We might see the IMU integrated in more smaller bikes. There's still some things that I think are missing, like a tire pressure monitoring system. I'd like to know if my tire pressure is low without having to physically check it every time I go out and ride. And it would be cool to see sub 400-pound super bikes in street trim. But I think motorcycling itself hasn't changed. It still requires a lot of attention and skill, and I don't think any amount of technology is going to change that. The dudes that are complaining about motorcycle tech getting out of hand, I think those guys are always going to complain about stuff like that. You're just getting freaking old, man. Sport bike tech is here to stay, and I embrace it with open arms. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.